The Gem State is changing every day, and as it does, the Idaho Matters podcast will help you know more about the changing communities and governments and cultures of Idaho. Listen to Idaho Matters today at boisestatepublicradio.org or in your favorite podcast app. More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. On Monday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Idaho can enforce part of its abortion trafficking ban, which means that someone who takes a minor across state lines to get an abortion without the parent's consent could go to jail. However, the judges also ruled that part of the law does not measure up under the First Amendment. And yesterday, the Ninth Circuit kicked another case back to a lower court to be decided. That one looks at whether doctors in Idaho can refer their patients out of state to get an abortion. The Ninth Circuit sent that case back to district court. So what does this mean for minors who are seeking an abortion here in Idaho, and where do we go from here? Well, joining us once again is Carter Sherman, a reproductive health and justice reporter with the Guardian U.S. newspaper. Carter, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So can we talk about the trafficking law itself? Idaho passed this law just last year. What does it say?
Well, the Idaho abortion trafficking ban, as it's called, is actually the first such ban in the country. Idaho effectively invented this crime. And what this statute does is it bans adults from recruiting, harboring, or transporting minors to get an abortion without their parents' consent. And the concern here was for abortion rights supporters that this law could apply to states where abortion is still legal. Abortion is almost totally banned in Idaho. And this law could prevent people from helping minors get abortions in states like Washington or Oregon, thereby cutting off access to a procedure that is still legal.
So this law was challenged really quickly, Carter. Who brought that lawsuit against it?
That lawsuit was brought by a few different abortion rights supporting organizations, as well as an attorney who helps folks who are survivors of sexual and domestic abuse. I think that point in particular is really important for folks to know about, because we know from studies that most minors who find themselves pregnant and are considering getting an abortion do involve their parents in that decision. The minors who don't are oftentimes among the most vulnerable children in our society. They might have parents who are incarcerated, who have been caught up in the immigration system. They might be living in an abusive home or have an abusive partner, or they might be just separated from their parents for some other kind of reason. And so the concern in particular for abortion rights supporters is that these are the kinds of minors who are going to be cut off from accessing, again, what could be a legal abortion elsewhere.
So a court actually blocked Idaho's law, and it was challenged in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, as I mentioned. So this gets us up to this week. What did the Ninth Circuit say?
The Ninth Circuit said several different things. And I think it's also important to note that this is actually not the final word on this law. This is all litigation over whether or not this law can be in effect while further litigation continues to play out. And what the Ninth Circuit did is it looked at the recruiting, harboring, and transporting provisions. And it says that the harboring and the transporting provisions, those can take effect, but not the recruiting provision. And that's because there's a concern that that word recruitment is too broad and that it would infringe on protected speech. For example, would it be recruitment, quote unquote, to give a minor just legal advice about access to abortion or to let her know that there are organizations that can help pay for an abortion? That speech is often protected by the First Amendment. And so the concern on the part of the Ninth Circuit was that, well, we can't go that far. And they blocked that particular part of the law from being enforced.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this right, as of right now, if someone takes a minor across state lines to get an abortion and they do not have the minor's parents' consent, they can still go to jail?
Well, so this is a really important question, obviously, and it would be really helpful to have a straight answer. But the fact of the matter is we kind of don't. And there's sort of three different elements to keep in mind here. So first of all, doing that, taking a minor across state lines, that could be illegal for reasons that have nothing to do with the abortion trafficking statute, right? Like that could be considered kidnapping, and a prosecutor could go after someone for that without even involving the abortion trafficking statute. So there's that element. There's also the element that due to sort of procedural legal hurdles, this law is not, or the Ninth Circuit's interpretation of this law is not actually in effect yet. What has to happen is a lower court has to take the Ninth Circuit decision and look at that and make a court order that is in line with that decision. And last I checked, that has not yet happened, but it will. So that brings us to the third element here, which is once that court order comes down, the question is, as you brought up, can someone go to jail for breaking it and taking a minor across state lines for the purposes of an abortion without parental consent? And the answer to that is it's really difficult at this time to know without actually seeing a prosecution happen. Because what the Ninth Circuit also said is that Idaho can't police things that are happening outside of Idaho. Like they don't have control over whether or not Oregon or Washington allows these kinds of abortions. But if you are a person who is taking a minor outside of Idaho, there's going to be a portion of that travel where you're still in Idaho. You have to get up to the Idaho border. And so the question is whether or not that part of the travel is enough to get someone criminalized. And I've talked to several experts about this, and the answer is basically, this is a kind of law we've never seen before, and we're going to know more about its enforcement and its interpretation once someone is criminalized under it.
So you mentioned recruiting part of this. So I want to talk a little bit about that because part of that law did stay blocked. And that is that part about, quote, recruiting a minor to have an abortion. And this had to do with free speech. So can you go a little bit more in depth about that part of it?
Yeah, so it's such a broad word. What does recruitment mean? And like, could this apply to legal advice? Could this apply to counsel? Could this apply to just letting someone know about their resources? And the Ninth Circuit sort of listed a number of things that could fall under the interpretation of recruitment in such a way that was really troubling to the court. And that is why they're saying this could infringe on First Amendment rights, and we can't really have this recruitment element be enforced in this way at this time.
Okay, so Reuters reported that both sides are actually claiming victory in this case, right? So what did Attorney General Rahul Labrador say after this ruling came down on Monday?
He did claim it as a victory. He brought up the fact that the court is going to allow the harboring and transporting provisions to take effect. And he said, we're defending life here in Idaho. The other side, the plaintiffs, the pro-abortion rights folks, they also claimed it as a victory. And they were really bringing up the fact that the recruitment element is not going to be allowed to take effect at this time. And I think both sides have won and both have lost in some ways. One of the plaintiffs in this case is an abortion fund. And an abortion fund is an organization that helps people navigate the logistical elements of getting an abortion. So they could pay for the procedure itself, they could pay for travel, they could pay for lodging. And abortion funds, since the fall of Roe, have been really worried about whether or not there are going to be restrictions on their ability to do that. And so with this law set to take effect in the way that it is, without that recruiting element, an abortion fund could theoretically in Idaho continue to operate. And I think that was really important to the plaintiffs to have that ability.
So one of the Ninth Circuit judges did say the entire challenge to this law should actually be dismissed. So what was this judge's argument?
It was a fairly technical argument, which was essentially that the plaintiffs in the case had sued the wrong person. They shouldn't have sued the AG. They should have sued the 44 county prosecutors in Idaho, because it's those prosecutors who would be making the frontline decision about whether or not to prosecute somebody under an abortion trafficking ban. And, it's a very, technical distinction that I think a lot of non-lawyers, such as myself, would not necessarily look at. But obviously, if that interpretation and that dismissal had carried the day, it would have had a huge impact on this law moving forward.
Well, and I think that's a really critical point, though, actually, because even though, the Attorney General has put this in place, right, and part of this has been upheld, he doesn't have the power to actually prosecute someone. It is one of the prosecutors in one of the counties. And a prosecutor in Ada County could make a completely different decision than, let's say, a prosecutor up in, over in Bannock County in eastern Idaho. So that's a very interesting distinction, but it seems that was not what the majority of the court agreed with.
No, the majority of the court was saying, let's look at what would actually happen here and look at the recruitment, look at the harboring, look at the transportation. And so that interpretation did not end up carrying the day. I'm sort of curious to see how all of this litigation continues to play out, though.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote that at least 20 states have passed laws restricting abortion since the U.S. Supreme Court, with the Dobbs decision, effectively overturned Roe v. Wade, and that Idaho has sort of become the front line for some of these laws. Are there other states with this kind of abortion trafficking law, or other states that, because of this decision on Monday, might look at doing something like Idaho has done?
Well, we're going to see. A lot of state legislatures have closed up shop for the year, but many of them open up in January, and we're going to start to see what kind of bills are coming out and if more states are having these kinds of abortion trafficking bans proposed. 4 states have already introduced legislation in these last sessions to have their own version of an abortion trafficking ban, and 1 state, Tennessee, has implemented that ban. Similarly to Idaho, that ban has now been frozen in litigation. But what is interesting here is that if you look at the text of the Idaho ban and you look at the text of the Tennessee ban, they're extremely similar. And in fact, they're actually extremely similar to some model legislation that's been drawn up by a major anti-abortion group. And so this has been a strategy, a longstanding strategy of the anti-abortion movement, is to use model legislation, which is legislation that is typically pre-written for legislators by a special interest group, and seed it throughout the country and see what kind of versions of this legislation end up passing and what kind of ends up being these restrictions that really garner speed and traction and can be passed and enforced all over the country. So I don't think that, whatever happens in Idaho is necessarily the end of the story for abortion trafficking.
So,
quote unquote.
What I'm trying to wrap my head around with all of this is, how would this be enforced? Because unless like the minor themselves or someone, unless a parent finds out that their minor child went across state lines and had an abortion, how in the world could you even prosecute this? I mean, we have a right to travel. What are you going to do? Stop everyone at the border?
I mean, it sounds draconian. I don't know that we're there tomorrow, but I think that this question of prosecution is actually something that has really been quite vexing in the post-Roe landscape. We know that abortions have actually risen since Roe was overturned. And that's in large part because people have traveled out of the states where abortion is banned and gotten the procedure done in states where it isn't. And it has been really frustrating for the anti-abortion movement to see that, and to see that there really hasn't been prosecution under these abortion bans. Abortion providers have not really been going to jail under that. And so what they've been doing in a lot of ways is looking for ways to amp up the prosecution and amp up the enforcement to actually cut down on abortion, because that is their ultimate goal. They believe that it's wrong and they would like to see less of it in this country.
So what happens in Idaho now? Can the plaintiff still appeal to the Ninth Circuit?
The Idaho can appeal the case again, appeal this particular decision, and that could even end up going all the way to the Supreme Court. What's happening now is that this case is going to be going through the litigation on the merits of the law. And so we're going to be seeing an actual, potentially concrete decision on the future of the law as litigation continues to play out.
Okay, so after that, the case just keeps going in the lower court. Is that correct?
Yes, still federal court, but lower court. It's going back to the district court now, and then they're going to have more broad litigation, potentially a trial over everything.
Well, as always, Carter, just really appreciate really all of your reporting on this. It's incredibly in depth, and really just appreciate everything you've been doing.
Well, thank you so much for having me on and paying attention to this very important issue.
You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.